Hi, my name is Indrawan, and in this video I'm gonna be explaining about a methodical history of a language teaching. I will explain it from a book by H. Dallas Brown. So let's get started. The first step toward developing a principled approach to language teaching will be turn back the clock about a century to learn from the historical cycles and trends that have brought us to the present day. This chapter focuses on methods as the identifying characteristics of a century of modern language teaching efforts. You will encounter references to concepts, constructs, issues, and models that are normally covered in a course in second language acquisition. In 1963, Edward Anthony gave his definition about an approach, method, and techniques. So approach, according to Edward, is a set of assumptions dealing with the nature of language teaching and learning. And method was described as an overall plan for systematic presentation of language based upon a selected approach. And techniques were the specific activities manifested in the classroom that were consistent with the method and therefore were in harmony with an approach as well. Jack Richards and Theodore Rogers in 1982 gave their opinion about method. So based on their opinion, method was an umbrella term for the specification and interrelation of theory and practice. They also gave their definition about approach, design, and procedure. So the approach defines assumptions, beliefs, and theories about the nature of language and language learning. And design specify the relationship of those theories to classroom materials and activities. And procedure is the techniques and practices that are derived from one's approach and design. So, changing winds and shifting sands. Albert McWhirter in 1972 saw these changing winds and shifting sands as cyclical pattern in which a new method emerged about every quarter of a century. Each new method broke from the old but took it some of the positive aspects of the previous practices. So the first method is the grammatical translation method. The characteristics are: the first is classes are taught in the mother tongue with little active use of target language. The second is much vocabulary is taught in the form of lists of isolated words. And the third is long, elaborate explanations of the intricacies of grammar are given. And the fourth is grammar provides the rules for putting words together, and instruction often focuses on the form of inflection of words. And next is reading of difficult classical texts began earlier. And the sixth is little attention is paid to the content of text, which are treated as exercises in grammatical analysis. And the seventh is often the drills or exercises in translating disconnected sentences from the target language into the mother tongue. And the eighth is little or no attention is given to pronunciation. And the disadvantages of the grammatical translation method is it does not virtually enhance a student's communicative ability in the language, because no one can understand why grammar translation remains so popular. It requires few specialized skills on the part of teachers. Tests of grammar rules and of translations are easy to construct and can be objectively scored. The next method is Guin and the series method. So, François Guin was a French teacher of Latin. So why he made the series method? Because he saw his 3-year-old nephew was going through the stage of child language acquisition. So he thought that the child must hold a secret to learn a language. So based on his opinion, language learning is primarily a matter of transforming perceptions into conceptions. So, and then he made a series method. So the series method was a method that taught a learner directly without translation and conceptually with the grammatical rules and explanations. A series of connected sentences that are easy to perceive. So basically the series method is like this. He taught the children with a series of sentences. As an example, I walk toward the door, I draw near to the door, I draw nearer to the door, I get to the door, I stop at a door, and much more. And the next method is the direct method. At the turn of the century, this method became quite widely known and practiced. In the direct method, it is mentioned that second language learning should be more like first language learning, like lots of oral interactions, spontaneous use of the language, no translation between first and second languages, little or no analysis of grammatical rules. The characteristics of the direct method is, the first one is classroom instructions were conducted exclusively in the target language. The second is only everyday vocabulary and sentences are taught. And the third is oral communication skills are built up in a carefully treated progression organized around the questions and answers, changes between teachers and students in small extensive classes. And the fourth is grammar is taught inductively, and so on. And then the disadvantages of the direct method is, the direct method didn't take well in public education, where the constraints of budget, classroom size, time, and teacher background made such method difficult to use. And then weak theoretical foundations, and it didn't take hold in the United States of America. The next method is the Odilingual method. In the 1930s and 1940s, the schools returned to grammatical translation method. The World War II heightened the need for Americans to become orally proficient in the language of both their allies and their enemies. So the background of the Odilingual method is Army Specialized Training Program. They made this Odilingual method. It's like a great deal of oral activities, pronunciation, and conversation practice with virtually none of the grammar and translation found in the traditional classes. The characteristics of the Odilingual method. The first one is new material is presented in dialogue form. The second is there is dependence of mimicry, memorization of set phrases, and overlearning. The third is structures are sequenced by means of constructive analysis, taught one at a time. And the fourth is structural patterns are taught using repetitive drills. And the fifth is there's little or no grammatical explanation. Grammar is taught by inductive analogy rather than deductive explanation, and much more. The disadvantages of the Odilingual method. The first is it failed to teach long-term communication proficiency, because language is not really acquired through a process of habit formation and overlearning, that errors were not necessarily to be avoided at all costs, and that structural linguistics didn't tell us everything about language that we needed to know. The second is cognitive code learning. So the background of the cognitive code learning is from a Chomskyan revolution in linguistics. Chomskyan revolution in linguistics is the children subconsciously acquire a system of rules. So in this cognitive code learning, classes retained by drilling typical of the Odilingual method, but added healthy doses of rule explanations and reliance of grammatical sequencing of materials. So it's like the combination of the Odilingual method and grammar translation. So cognitive code learning was not so much a method as it was an approach that emphasizes a conscious awareness of rules and their applications to second language learning. So the next material is Designer of Methods of the Spirited 1970s. So the first is Community Language Learning, or CLL. So it was first introduced by Charles Curran, created a classic example of an effectively based method, what he called the counseling learning. in 1972. So it is basically said that the social dynamics of such a group were of primary importance. So the methodology is the group of clients, which is students having first established on their native language and interpersonal relationship and trust, were seated in a circle with a counselor, which is teacher, on the outside of the circle. As they talked, the counselor translated the dialect in a second language, which is English. The learner repeated that English sentence as accurately as possible. Advantages and disadvantages of community language learning. So effective advantages. The counselor allows the learner to determine the type of conversation and to analyze the foreign language inductively. The counselor teacher could become non-directive. Translation is a complex process. It's often easier said than done. The next is Suggestopedia. It was first introduced by Georgy Lozanev in 1979. He's a Bulgarian psychologist. He believed that the human brain could process great quantities of material if given the right condition for learning, which are a state of relaxation and giving over of control to the teacher. So the disadvantages of the Suggestopedia is the right conditions may not be available wherever this method was taught, like the using of music and comfortable chairs. It replaced the understanding process in language learning by memorization techniques. And the next is the silent way. It was first introduced by Celeb Gategno in 1972. It was mentioned that learning is facilitated if the learner discovers or creates rather than remember and repeats what is to be learned. Learning is facilitated by accompanying or mediating physical objects. Learning is facilitated by problem solving involving the material to be learned. The disadvantages of the silent way is the silent way was too harsh a method and the teacher was too distant, like they had to get out of my way, while students worked out solutions to encourage a communicative atmosphere. The learners need to more guidance and overt corrections than it permitted, and there aren't any specialness in this method. By using the roads and charts, it can look like any other language classroom. The next is total physical response, or TPR. It was first introduced by James Asher in 1977. The instructor is the director of a stage play in which the students are the actors. Students did a deal of listening and acting. The teacher was very directive in orchestrating and performance. Imperative mode was utilized to teach even into more advanced levels, introduced by humor to make the atmosphere comfortable enough for the learning process. The disadvantages of this total physical response is the TPR lost its distinctiveness as learners advanced in their competence. In reading and writing activities, students were limited to spinning off the oral work in the classroom. Soon the leader's need for spontaneity and unrest language must be met, not only the trace actions. And then the natural approach. It was first introduced by Stephen Krashen in 1982. So it is said that the teacher should provide the basic comprehensible input communication skill for everyday language situation. Learners don't to say during the silent period until they feel ready to do so. The teacher is the source of the learner's input, stimulating variety of classroom activities, games, skits, comments, and the like. And there are 3 stages of the natural approach. The first is the pre-production stage, is the development of listening comprehension skills. The early production stage is usually marked with errors as the student struggles with language. The last stage is one of extending production into longer stretches of discourse involving more complex games, role plays, discussions, and so forth. The objective in this is to promote fluency. The disadvantages of the natural approach is the heavy emphasis on comprehensible input in the silent period. What about the students whose speech never emerges? And with all students on different timetable for this called emergence, how does the teacher manage a classroom efficiently? How does one know which structures the learners are to provide that with? And there's so much more about the and there another more about designer of methods in the spirited there's so much more, and there much more about designer of methods of the spirited 1970s, so such as functional syllabuses and study guide. So I think that's all from me. I think that's all the explanation for me. Thank you for attention. Thank you for listening, and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.